Welcome to all of you. I know that Patricia is connected by phone, so on audio. So when you speak, please, I would suggest that you turn on the microphone. First, let me welcome our South African colleagues, Mr. Neil Cole, who is the head of CABRI, which stands for the Collaborative African Budget Reform Initiative. I got it right?
Yes.
Oh, lovely. The reason I got it right because we are doing a new CPS for South Africa. So only yesterday I actually checked it up and actually made sure that the acronym was correct in the document, that we had spelled it out correctly. Let me give you a little bit of a brief backdrop to this discussion, and then I'll introduce Neil and initiate the conversation. First of all, as many of you know, President Jim Kim was in South Africa in September of last year. So we were having a discussion with the Minister of Finance and the team of the National Treasury. And among the things that the President was very impressed during his trip into South Africa was that a lot of initiatives that are underway in South Africa to improve service delivery, despite all the problems, and we know the problems, but there are a lot of things that are going on and a lot of effort to try to learn internally. But then we also know, as we talked to a lot of the people, that there's a lot that the rest of the world can also learn from what's happening in South Africa. So when he proposed to the Minister of Finance that we need to actually distill some of the excellence or the initiatives that the rest of the world can learn from, the Minister immediately said CABRI. And the first thing that he actually put was CABRI, and I didn't even know what CABRI was at that particular point in time. So CABRI is really an African initiative, an initiative that South Africa has launched with many other African countries to try to improve something which is very fundamental, and which is to improve budgeting in the countries that have joined that initiative. So with that preface, I would like to introduce Mr. Neil Cole. I also had the pleasure of meeting Neil only recently, for the first time, just a few weeks ago, thanks to Joel. What I do know is that Neil has been an old hand with the National Treasury, is very familiar with the budget. I think you led the budget preparations for many years. Before, I think in 2004, I think this CABRI initiative was born, and Neil put his heart and soul, maybe, to try to make this initiative a real live thing that can actually help the other countries there. I think this initiative has really caught on. I'm here to learn more about it, and I'm sure all of you are. And I think we are also here as part of an effort to try to deepen the World Bank's engagement with the CABRI initiative to see how we can actually partner in some of the other countries that are members of CABRI, that we can help make a difference. With that, Neil, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Asad. And your story of meeting with the Minister of Finance reminds me of another story where I was with the previous Minister of Finance, Trevor Manuel, on an outreach to a G8 meeting that took place in Potsdam, when Germany was president of the G8. And I think the former finance minister of Germany, Pierre Steinbrück, introduced an initiative that they called at the time a good financial governance plan for Africa. And the discussion was about how there can be this collaboration and support from the German government and the G8 for this initiative. And the former finance minister of South Africa, Trevor Manuel, said exactly the same thing. But there are initiatives like CABRI. Okay. There's a lot that is being done in Africa to develop good financial governance. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And as Asad says, my name is Neil Cole. I've spent about 13 years in the Ministry of Finance, working in the Budget Office, and for most of that time heading up a division called Expenditure Planning. At the time, we started the initiative called CABRI, and I've been with the initiative ever since, and have now taken the decision to drop one of my jobs and to take on the CABRI job on a full-time basis, and that is literally happening as I'm talking. The boxes are being moved out of the National Treasury to CABRI's own offices. and fortunately for me, I'm not going to be carrying any boxes. So what I'd like to do is to speak a bit about CABRI, and then run you through some work that CABRI has done in Africa with ministries of finance that provides our assessment of the state of budget reforms or the state of public financial management in Africa. And it's certainly, when I present this, I'm very open to receiving as much feedback as possible, not only from the discussants, but also from all of you around the room, because all of you have at some point in time, or maybe have ongoing work that you're doing in Africa on public financial management, and feel very free to even correct some of the statements that I may make, because some of the work is ongoing. So quickly, CABRI is a network of senior budget officials that work in African ministries of finance, and in some cases, people working in ministries of planning, where the budget function is located within a ministry of planning. And sometimes these ministries are also called ministries of finance and planning. Sometimes they joined up, sometimes they separate. We call it in Africa a marriage and a divorce, and then getting remarried. But it's where the budget function is located, where we will get the person to participate. It's normally a person at the level of budget director, or in some cases director general budgets. Sometimes we do get permanent secretaries participating. Sometimes we do get deputy directors participating in our events, depending on whether it is a policy dialogue or a training program. We started in 2004 with a first workshop that focused on some of the more common reforms that African ministries of finance were taking up. There were 16 African countries that participated, and the reason we came up with the idea of CABRI was a point that Asad made, and that was that there was lots of interest in the reforms that South Africa was implementing, especially around the medium-term expenditure framework, moving towards program budgeting, and also how South Africa had improved on the information that it was providing. So lots of interest. I remember when I was in the budget office receiving delegations from Uganda, from Rwanda, from Botswana, even as far afield as Pakistan, and at one point we got a delegation that came in from China, all keen to find out what it is that South Africa is doing in its reforms. I then got together with my peers in the Ministry of Finance in Uganda, and the budget director working in Mozambique, and we came up with this idea of bringing together our counterparts in different finance ministries who were tackling the issue of wanting to reform and improve on public financial management in their countries. We moved towards an international organization status in 2009, not because we felt that it was necessary for our survival to institutionalize CABRI, but because many countries were saying that it would be the one way that they would be able to make a financial contribution to the work of CABRI if we become an international organization. So we are now an international organization. We have an international agreement. We have a host country agreement with the Ministry of, with the South African government. There are so far 9 official members, so these are countries that pay a membership fee. Let me run through them quickly. It's Mali, Senegal, Central African Republic, Ghana, Kenya, Rwanda, South Africa, Mauritius, and Lesotho. But we've had about 45 countries that have participated in our events. The structure is that of a General Assembly, and that's all the official members, a management committee, 5 of those, and then a CABRI secretariat of 8 staff that sit in Pretoria. That's our vision and mission. I'm sure you will have handouts of this, so I'm not going to read through it. It's quite ambitious. In some respects, it is about developing the appropriate approaches, procedures, and practices, but some of it is also about the promotion of common positions on public finance management reforms. So we do a lot of development and work with ministries of finance in developing approaches to doing certain things, whether it is program budgeting or medium-term expenditure frameworks. But we also play quite a fair amount, or we undertake quite a fair amount of work in promoting African positions, such as promoting the use of country systems, aid transparency at the high-level forums that have taken place, and also other global forums. Let me speak about the three non-administrative programs. There's one more, which is an administrative program. The first is a program on budget system reform. So these are the programs of CABRI. The first is budget system reform, and in that program we've undertaken the work on good public finance governance, which I'll speak about later. The work that we do on budget transparency, and there's quite a big project that we're undertaking jointly with the IBP, the International Budget Partnership, over the next 3 years, and then also our work on program-based budgeting, and there we work quite closely with the Afrotax across Africa. Our sector dialogues focus on value for money. We've covered health financing thus far. We're halfway through a sector dialogue on education financing, and we're soon to launch quite a big project on agriculture financing for over the next 3 years. Let me speak quickly about those, because I'm not going to cover them in later slides. I mean, the idea here is to get into the same room, or to get a dialogue going between Ministry of Finance officials and officials from sector ministries around the way that the sector has been financed and if it's an innovative way to study that as a case study, and then to share that with other ministries of finance and sector ministries across Africa. The recent one on education focused on an education voucher system that's used in Mozambique, and we also had a case study that looked at the decentralized financing and administration of education in Ghana. The third program is knowledge development. This is where we have our annual seminar located, and the annual seminar is our flagship event. We will have our 9th one in August, and that will take place in Nairobi. We've taken the annual seminar to many parts of Africa. We also have a budget resource center that we're working on. And we've been in discussion with the World Bank Institute, with the ODI, and also with IBP to look at which parts of the Budget Resource Center we can collaborate on. And it's also in that program where we do the budget data gathering and analysis. So that's the programs of CABRI. So let's start with the work that we've done on good public financial governance. And this was a collaborative effort that was undertaken by 3 PFM networks in Africa. The first was AfroSci, the network that works with Supreme Audit Institutions. So AfroSci, for those that do not know, stands for the African Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions. And they affiliated to INTOSAI. And I think there are 2 other AfroScis, one for Arab-speaking Africa and then the other one for Francophone. The other network was the African Tax Administrators Forum, that is slightly newer than CABRI, and then CABRI. We covered in this work that we did on good public financial governance, budget preparation and execution, tax administration, accounting and reporting, and financial liabilities. So it was an investigation into the state of public finance management, looking at the tax side, the budget and planning side, and then also on the accounting and auditing side. And we also undertook a fair amount of consultation in Africa with civil society organizations, with parliamentarians, with the African Union, and also the Economic Commission for Africa. Coming out of the 4 pieces of research, we pulled that into a status report, and the status report contains what we formulated, and that is 6 principles of good public financial governance. And these are principles that have been developed by these 3 African institutions following a fair amount of consultation. Those principles cover transparency, accountability, capacity building, accountability institutions, who leads on reforms, etc. And the report is available on the CABRI website. We took the principles to the 47th annual meetings of the African Development Bank in Arusha, where we had a high-level panel where the principles were debated by governors, and there's also an endorsement of the principles in the final report that was the culmination of the annual meetings. You're free to tell me to speed up, or I have 5 minutes or 1 minute, or I should shut up. All right. Out of this report, we identified some key achievements in Africa. We have found that there are better legal frameworks in place, that there are more, let me say, realistic fiscal frameworks that countries in Africa are putting in place. There are efforts towards modernizing budget classification in terms of international standards. We're certainly seeing improvements in central budget processes and better mechanisms for sector planning, but still largely located at the national level. The story at the decentralized level is still very weak and quite different to what's happening at the national level. We are seeing widespread efforts to make available performance information. Many countries have introduced or are attempting to introduce program-based budgeting that contains a performance information, and I'll show a table that shows which countries have introduced performance-based budgeting or program-based budgeting. We've seen some progress towards risk-based internal audit, and also the introduction of accounting standards and improved in-year reporting. Just to say that a lot of the achievements that we've seen are the achievements at the budget formulation stage. A very different picture reveals itself when one looks at how countries are doing on the budget execution front. Just in terms of the reform weaknesses, the report identifies some upstream and weaknesses and downstream weaknesses. On the upstream weaknesses in revenue forecasting, still high levels of non-transparency in extra budgetary activities, the involvement of cabinet and the colleagues of the Minister of Finance in the budget process is still quite weak, and as a result, some off-budget or outside of budget process allocations that we have found being made. The ongoing problem of the separation between capital and recurrent we are seeing. And then on some of the downstream ones, problems with the management of cash, weak commitment controls, payroll weaknesses. Many countries have introduced IFMA systems to try to resolve some of those programs with varied successes. Huge procurement weaknesses, even in countries where reforms have been ongoing for some time, or where they are where the state of PFM in other areas are quite comparable with that of many developed countries. We are finding that those countries are still facing severe procurement problems. I mean, take countries such as my own country, very good budget process, very good budget documentation that's put in place. Scores number 2 on the Open Budget Index. After New Zealand, it beats the UK, it beats France, it beats the US, beats Australia, but very, very serious procurement problems. South Africa has just appointed a chief procurement officer, and I say to people that under this minister, it's probably going to be more of a chief procurement police officer than somebody that's going to be focusing on policy and implementation. Some of the high-level priorities that we identified in the Good Financial Governance study, fiscal transparency shortfalls, and that's why the number one principle of this that's come out of the study is a principle that commits countries to fiscal transparency. If you look at the OBI, South Africa scores number 2, Uganda is second, and then there's a large bunching of African countries near the bottom. So, I mean, we're not doing that well when it comes to budget transparency. Ownership and sequencing of reforms, another high priority, alignment of PFM capacity and reforms. Political leadership and ownership, a big weakness in many situations, and then also just the prioritization of African management of aid and integration into the budget. Let's shift on to program-based budgeting in Africa, using the OECD definitions. Presentational performance systems. These are systems where the program budget of a country is a parallel budget. So it's not the budget that is appropriated. The line item budget is appropriated, and there's a parallel process that has very little to do with budget allocation. And there are several African countries that fit into that definition of presentational performance systems. I put this up at a workshop, at an East Afritac workshop, where countries from East Africa that belong to East Afritac were present. Malawi thought that they had a program-based budget that was more performance-informed than presentational. I'm not too sure about that. But those are the countries, and the dates are when countries introduced this form of budget. And then there's a grouping of countries that have a performance informed, and this is where some of the allocations that are made are informed by performance, by programs that are defined by those countries, but the appropriation still happens at a line item level. And then 3 countries where the budget that is tabled is the performance-based budget that is tabled. And a very similar picture also shows itself when you look at the medium-term expenditure framework, which countries are tabling their MTFs as the budget that is to be appropriated in the first year, with the 2 outer years information. But you have Mauritius, Rwanda, and South Africa there that table their performance-based budget or their program-based budget as the budget that is going to be appropriated. Some of the challenges. Capacity in the implementation. The Mauritius case study is an informative one in how they dealt with the capacity constraints. The linking of the planning and budgeting function, just the setting out of this reform. How are you going to undertake this reform? I think the Mozambican case study is an informative one here in terms of several starts and stops, and who is ultimately responsible for the rolling out. I mean, Renaud did quite a bit of work in Mozambique. He's a lot more familiar with what happened in Mozambique. And then just the organizational requirements and the culture of change that is required. I mean, this is a big reform, program-based budgeting. It does require a change of mindset, a change in the way that you're doing things. And it's not a reform that you can concentrate within the Ministry of Finance. This form is successful when it starts to happen in the sector ministries and at the different levels of government. Political buy-in, a difficult one to conquer with this reform, and then also the legal challenges, especially in Francophone countries where you probably do need a change to the legislation in order for the reform to work. And then, just working with major stakeholders. I've included a couple of case studies that I think is quite informative when it comes to this reform. I'm not going to go through each one of them in any level of detail, because I think that we probably do want to get into the responses and also some discussion. We have a study that we did on Burkina Faso, and the study is available on the website. We also included Mozambique in a study, and what is quite informative here, as I said, was that linking between the planning and the budgeting, and why this is such a good basis to start off with this reform. In the case of Mauritius, followed an iterative approach to the program structure and costing, and also good lessons about how they went about training many officials in the Mauritian government to roll out this reform. We also studied program budgeting in Tunisia. I visited the Ministry of Finance there, and despite the changes at a political level, very impressed by the capacity within the ministries of finance to actually keep such a reform going. We did a joint country case study in Namibia recently, and this was where we went into Namibia, conducted many interviews with government officials, politicians, parliamentarians, civil society organizations to get their inputs on program budgeting in Namibia. We then invited 3 other countries to peer review the Namibian case. It was Liberia, Botswana, and Kenya. So also another interesting case in Namibia. Let me move to MTFs and what we found in Africa. Couple of countries that do not have. Well, I may not speak about a couple of countries because when I'm in an English-speaking country and when either is present, a couple means 2, right? In South Africa, when we speak about a couple, it can be any amount. Several countries have no MTF. They're listed there. And then you have this variation in terms of what countries are calling their medium-term perspective. Some is more on the fiscal side in terms of the allocation over a medium term. Some of it has a stronger focus on the budget. And in the case of South Africa, you do see, and Mauritius and Burkina Faso, where you do see a fair amount of information in terms of what the funds that are estimated for the second and the third year is going to be used for. On budget transparency, a lot of this information comes from the work that we are doing with the IBP, the International Budget Partnership, and a lot of it is also informed by the Open Budget Index for 2008 and 2010, and also what will inform the work that is going forward. Not a very good picture. I mean, there's been some improvement in transparency. What is quite worrying is that there are many countries that are stagnating. And I think it's probably a bigger failure is not that you're moving too slow, but that you are stuck in in your scores on transparency. A couple of charts that we've taken from the Open Budget Index, and also contained in our recent publication on budget transparency. So you see, South Africa is up there, number 2. An improvement in 2008 from 2006, and then falling back slightly in 2010. There's a discussion that we're having with OBI. There are 1 or 2 areas where South Africa did not do so badly, but where we think that maybe what South Africa is doing may have been interpreted incorrectly. But if you're number 2 out of, I think, 98 countries, you can let a couple of points go, right? And then Uganda is the next, and Uganda falls in a category with the United States in terms of providing a significant amount of information. And then Namibia, and then we have quite a few countries. Egypt has fallen down quite badly for understandable reasons, and then Chad, the worst performer. What this graph shows is the different areas and how countries are performing in macro fiscal information, revenue, borrowing, etc. What we have seen is some deterioration in the quality of medium-term estimates, and also the information that is provided there, and in India, actual expenditure. We've seen some improvement in providing past year's information, and also on the budget year estimates. And the budget year would be the year that is appropriated. Common challenges to improve or sustain fiscal transparency, legal requirements, legislating transparency. We found that information that is provided internally for decision making within the budget process doesn't always translate into better information that is provided externally. Very, very weak processes within the legislator, who is expected to play an important role in demanding information to be made available. Many legislators do not have the capacity to examine information when provided, but also do not very clearly articulate the kind of information that they require. Weak supreme audit institutions, etc., etc. And that's all from me. Thank you for your attention, and sorry for speeding it up so much at the end, but I wanted to hear from you as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil, actually for providing a perspective, a broad perspective that covers so many countries in the African subcontinent. But I also, I think the way that we are going to actually carry on the conversation is that we have a panel of 3 people here, and I'll request them each to actually maybe provide comments no more than 5 minutes, I think, and then we will give you a chance to respond to those comments, and then we will open it up to other comments and questions from the audience here. So let me actually start with the person at my extreme left, Robert Hunja. Robert is manager in the World Bank Institute. He actually runs or heads the open government practice. South Africa is also an original signatory of the Open Government Partnership. And so I think it's nice to actually, it would be interesting also for me to see how the two connect. And then after that, I'll request my, a move this way to cover the rest of the panelists. Robert.
Thank you very much. I'll actually be quite brief because Neil has shared with us a fair amount of information about what CABRI is doing. One of the great things actually about CABRI is that it's one of the few networks, I would say not just on the African continent, but worldwide, that is really owned by its members. I mean, it's it's one of the few networks we have seen where the members actually drive the agenda, they are clear about what they want to do, and they get it done. And that's really great. And we are quite excited that that Neil is taking over and giving CABRI 100% of his attention, because our senses are that will drive CABRI to its kind of next orbit. So that's really all very good news. I'll use less than my 5 minutes because I want to say 3 very quick things. And it's really just to suggest kind of what, at least from where I see it, both as an African, but also about somebody who cares about budgets and the execution. The 3 things I think I see as the next frontier. Thing number 1 is that reforming budgets is difficult for all the reasons that we know. I don't think I need to go into that because it's all about the money and it's all about what you do with the money. And I think so far, those of us in the development business, but also networks such as CABRI, have focused a lot of work kind of on the technical side of the budget. So we talk a lot about MTEFs, about performance-based budgets, we talk about IFMISs, and I was really intrigued to hear from Neil this morning that at their next CABRI event, what they really want to start focusing on is on the how of reforms. What is it that has made it so difficult to push forward reforms on the African continent regarding budgets, and not so much to focus about learning what are MTEFs and what's performance-based and all that stuff, but to really begin to talk about the soft side of how do you actually get things to happen. And I think even here in the bank, I think that is one piece of action where we should be a lot. Some people call it the political economy. I think it's a lot more complicated than just the political economy, but really focusing more on how do you get things to happen on the ground and to move the dial, whether it's transparency, whether it's all the other things that need to be done. So how do we focus better on the how of reforms? And the second piece is around participation. Again, institutions such as the bank, but also CABRI, largely because it's owned by directors of budget from the Ministry of Finance, focus very much on what the government needs to do. I think we do need a little bit of what we are learning now, especially where you're facing difficult governance issues, is that the more you can bring more stakeholders to pay attention to the issue, to contribute towards bringing change, whether on the advocacy side, whether on the learning side, whether it's think tanks and universities, whether it's trade unions and other movements, to come together to coalesce around. And so, for example, on the budget side, I think there's the next frontier on this work is around how do you bring more participatory processes to the budget question. And a little bit of work that we are doing here in WBI is to begin to kind of think through this question. How do you get more stakeholders, CSOs, parliaments, media, and others to have the capacity to be able to engage on the budget question and how that trajectory can move forward? So I think that's a second piece of work where we could, I think, all focus on a little bit more. And the third one, and here I must confess, since we are in the age of transparency, I care about procurement because it's something I've cared about most of my kind of professional career. I was really intrigued to hear what Neil said about this question. And it's really a big quandary that countries like, if you look, in fact, on the OBI in Africa, the 2 leading countries, which are South Africa and Uganda, very significant procurement problems. And this is a lot of where, as we all know, a lot of the public resources are used to procure things so that services can be delivered. My own theory about this is twofold. One is that is not by accident, it's by default, that procurement still continues to be plagued by very serious deficiencies. And part of that is because, again, from where I sit, I think we've left the procurement problem to the procurement people. And we've said, let the procurement people deal with the procurement issues in the country. I think it's time where we who care about budgets and about performance really engaged on this question and began to see how can we move the dial on the procurement problem. Because, again, as we have seen, we can be as transparent and as open and as all those other good things as possible. But if procurement continues to be not just from the corruption perspective, but from the service delivery side continues to be a problem, then all this work amounts to almost, we don't get as much impact as we should. So those 3 things, I think, from my perspective, focusing on the soft how reforms, greater participatory processes from people just, what some people call the non-state players, and then bringing a lot of attention by many of us on the procurement problem. Thank you very much.
But I think the South African authorities may have already anticipated your comment on procurement, because the chief procurement officer that Neil was mentioning, who has just been appointed, is actually a Ministry of Finance official who is very familiar with budgeting and budget processes. So I think looks like they're already moving at least on one of your recommendations very clearly. So let me now ask Renaud Seligmann to actually to make some comments. Renaud is a sector manager in the Africa region, in the Operations Quality Group. He oversees the financial management work in West and Central Africa. Renaud.
Thanks very much, Asad. It's a great pleasure to be with Neil. I think we met for the first time back in Mozambique a few years ago, and then along the years since then. So I thought I would share with you a few slides. Don't worry, not too many, and I will stick to my 5 minutes. That present the same data in a slightly different shape. Because I think it's quite thought-provoking. This is a map of Africa which represents, in numerical fashion, the PFA, Public Expenditure and Financial Accountability Assessment data for all the countries for which this has been done. And the only two ones that are not there that have been undertaken are Nigeria and Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe because it was done since then. Nigeria because the government still hasn't agreed to validate the assessment. And what it shows is that there's a huge diversity in the continent. You know, you go from South Africa and Mauritius, which are in green here at the bottom, to countries that are doing actually pretty well, like Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, Uganda, Malawi, Zambia, Namibia, etc., which are countries that we could call countries of the top league in the region. And these are countries that, from the PFA perspective, i.e. in terms of what the PFA measures, which is whether they have the right systems in place, whether they have the right legal framework in place, whether they have the right institutions in place and calendars, and whether they have some limited elements of performance that are the PFA measures that are doing well. You know, there's this top league. And then you have your Central African Republic, Sudan, Côte d'Ivoire way back. Hopefully, the one that is happening now will change that. Who are experiencing some very significant weaknesses. But if you look at the data from another slice, and this is some work that we did with Matt Andrews and the Brookings institutions a few years back, and that we've updated now, you can see that. If you take the three leagues, so let's say the third of the countries on the right are the top league, and you can see that the upstream processes are better than the downstream processes, even for that league. So what Neil was saying applies even to the top performers on the continent. Also, implementation is more of an issue than the legal framework, even for the top league. And centralized PFM is better than deconcentrated or decentralized PFM. Again, even for the top league. And you switch then your attention to the bottom league, right? The Togo, Lesotho, Burundi, Guinea-Bissau of this world. And there, obviously, the weakest link is magnified, right? So you have very poor execution of the budget. You have very poor oversight. And you have and the strongest part of the system, which is maybe the budget preparation, maybe they have a good calendar in place, maybe they have some element of forward planning, doesn't go very far because the way in which the budget is executed is so different from the way in which the budget is planned. So the issue is, how do we address those issues of focusing on the downstream as well as the upstream, focusing on the actual implementation of the rules as well as the rules themselves, and focusing on the deconcentrated actors, focusing on the provinces and the districts and the line ministries as well as the central ministries. These are some of the key issues for us in terms of the how-to that Robert was talking about. So what does that mean for us? It means that we have to move from the quality of PFM systems, from the laws, the institutions, the IT systems, the IFMISs, to how they work in practice. What are they delivering in terms of discipline? Aggregate fiscal discipline, are they delivering? I would submit that yes, by and large they are delivering. And the way in which the African countries have weathered the recent financial crisis has shown that they are delivering, because they were able to keep control over the macro-fiscal elements of their economies. Strategic allocation, in planning it's not too bad. If you look at the poverty reduction strategies and how they're translated into budget, it's okay, but the execution is where it falls short. And that also speaks to the efficiency picture, the value for money. Are we getting value for money from our investments at the moment? And I would submit not nearly as much as we should, which is why it's critical to strengthen capital budget execution, including externally funded projects, including World Bank projects, but as part of a broader subset, which is the capital budget in our countries. And there I fully agree with Robert, and that's why we're working with procurement very closely, particularly in West African Economic and Monetary Union countries, to help them focus on, one, increasing the execution rate for capital budget, and two, increasing the value for money proposition of their procurement, which is a real issue. That involves linking the central finance agencies to the line ministries and making sure that that dialogue, which is not often taking place, is taking place on what is it that we're getting for the amount that we're spending in education and health. What kind of quality of education are we getting? What kind of access are we getting? What kind of quality? Are we spending so much money on drugs, pharmaceuticals? Are they getting delivered to the health centers? Here, the service delivery indicators are really a helpful tool to help us get to that lower point of service delivery. Finally, the next frontier is clearly not so much to say the supply side of the governance equation is no longer relevant. We have to focus only on the demand side. Not to say, the demand side is not so significant, let's look at the supply. It's about the connection between the two. It's about making sure that information is produced that is relevant and useful, making sure that audits are produced that are relevant and useful, but that then this is used by Parliament, that this is used by the media, that this is used by civil society, that people who are supposed to benefit from service delivery actually have an opportunity to use the information and to improve service delivery. Thanks, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Renaud. Let me now introduce our third panelist, Anand Rajaram. Anand is in PRIM in the Africa region. He's the practice leader for the governance group. Anand.
Thanks, Asad, and thanks, Neil, for an interesting presentation. Since we're all reminiscing about when we first met Neil, I think it was 2007 at Durban. There was the G22 event, so that's when I remember first meeting you. I probably visited you in your office. A couple of comments in the lines of what Robert was saying. I think the importance of a peer learning network is huge. And in a sense, I look at CABRI like the equivalent of the senior budget officials group in the OECD. The PEMPAL group that my colleague Robert Aliercio helped establish in Europe and Central Asia. And some groups that he's also now establishing now, I think, in East Asia. So I'm very glad to know that I've been aware of this for about 7 or 8 years, the CABRI group, and good to hear how well they're doing. I'm going to offer a bit of candid introspection, because that slide you put up, Neil, which showed how many weaknesses exist, is pretty comprehensive. So even though, yes, there have been improvements in budget formulation, frankly, none of us should be very proud that the systems are improving. And I think that we should force ourselves to ask, why is that? We can't all just blame it on the politics. That's part of it for sure. But I'd like to offer a couple of thoughts. I think we don't quite understand how institutions change. And really what we're talking about with budgetary institutions are very important institutions of governance that we haven't quite figured out how to make that change happen. And that should make us think about how might we collaborate and think about this problem going forward. I don't think we design institutions that are consistent with carrying capacity. And the conviction with which people bring to this is missing because we're going at them too much with technology, too much with complex concepts, which are not organically plantable. So let me put that proposition out there that we need to think about how we do this. How do you really get institutional change? How do you do it consistent with political incentives? How do you do this so that behaviors change? And I think that's an important thing we might talk about a bit more. This issue about what are the priorities for Africa going forward? To me, certainly procurement is a big, big weakness across many countries. But it's an aspect of the problem because that's the rent-seeking aspect. It does seem to me that as we engage with governments, particularly natural resource-rich countries, there is this commodity boom that is benefiting many countries. Are they translating that into long-term developmental assets, both human skills and infrastructure assets? And that's not going to happen if the public investment management process is recognized as a distinctive aspect of the budget process with very specific requirements, including the procurement issues. So I would tie in not only procurement broadly for supplies, but the procurement of capital assets as part of your public investment process. It's hugely neglected. It's a huge payoff area if we can get it right, but it will involve tackling the procurement issues as also the broader challenge in these questions. We have all said why data is important. I mean, if governments don't care about data for policy analysis, we can't make them care for it. So I would like to suggest that perhaps the classification systems are arcane, they're not really user-friendly, and we could all sort of do a better job in translating that data into formats that are actually visually and otherwise compelling for policymakers. So without pushing our internal sort of processes, we do have this boost instrument, which is proving itself to be quite useful. It's been applied quite widely in the European Central Asia region. It was originally invented in Uganda by one of my colleagues, Dino Meroto, in Uganda. I think there's potential to use that to, in some sense, simplify the budget, make more people interested in it, and go with all the issues that Renaud was talking about. So the combination of these two things would be great. If we are to deal with the politics of budget reforms, it seems to me this network of CABRI brings enormous insights into what's really going on in terms of government, in terms of what are the incentives to do better management. We as technocrats from outside can bring ideas to the table as well. So maybe an alliance of technocrats with stakeholders outside is what we need to think about in difficult authorizing environments. But even in difficult authorizing environments, we need to be a little bit more flexible in thinking about catalytic change, small catalytic change. That is possible. And I can give you an example from Cameroon, which was otherwise quite inhospitable, and I have a classic example of a project that did not work, and a small program that worked in the customs department. And that gives us insights about, in a difficult authorizing environment, still look for the things that can make change happen, which can then spark other changes. So I would suggest we think about this issue of institutional change, catalytic change, and how do we address the public investment management and procurement challenges. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Anand. So maybe Neil, if you don't mind, if you may want to respond to, don't feel obliged to respond to every suggestion that people have made, but I think you have the liberty of picking 2 or 3 that you may want to respond in a few minutes, and then we'll open it up to the rest.
I agree with everything that has been said. Let me just pick up on one thing that Anil said. I spent most of my time since arriving here, and that was on Wednesday, with Oxfam and with USAID. And the event was the launch of Oxfam's study that they did on USAID reforms. And a strong thread that is coming through in the reforms is that USAID needs to shift from doing things on behalf of communities and for communities, and now providing communities with the support that allows them to do things for themselves. And this is Anil's point. You need to then focus on building strong institutions, because if you are going to convince Congress that whilst the banner may say from the American people, that once that money hits Malawi, it belongs to Malawi, you are going to have to convince that the institutions to use country systems and to get the money to flow through the budget process in Malawi is going to have to be quite strong. In a radio interview yesterday, I was asked, so besides education and health, what are some of the other things that development assistance should focus on? And for very unselfish reasons, I said, well, a lot more money needs to go into PFM reform, into building of institutions, if we are to realize this reform within USAID now, where communities are going to participate a lot more actively in the programs that USAID supports. That's my comment. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Let me open it up to the floor and see, and very briefly, if you can identify yourself and keep your question short. Thank you.
I'm Boris Weber, WBI Open Government. This was a great presentation and great comments. I was interested to hear from you as a practitioner from some country examples, specifically on participation under kind of two angles. You know, if we talk about institutional capacity and retaining that capacity over time, that can obviously be accomplished through supply side measures and strengthening capacity, but having a broader set of constituents paying attention to transparency of budgets and having them be an active part of it can also create the incentive systems to comply with these higher standards. So I would be interested if you have examples that could show us that kind of emerging as a virtuous circle. And secondly, we have seen this trend to program budgeting over the years, and that's when we really need to kind of close the link between the upstream and the downstream stuff, because then the value for money question, you know, needs to be linked back to the planning process. And I would be very interested to hear from you if you have seen examples where, again, the participatory approach has actually helped government collect the missing data on performance. So if we talk about performance-based budgeting, we have a lack of data, and that's why this is not functioning. Can we see participation not as the nice thing to do because we have to talk to all these people and it's complicated and then all have their concerns, but can we see it as a value to access data that's desperately needed to inform the performance-based budgeting process and to close that loop?
Thanks. Let me get a couple more questions before Neil can maybe Robert.
Thanks very much, Neil, and to the organizers. That was a very interesting presentation. My name is Rob Talercio. I'm in East Asia and the Pacific. And as Anand said, the bank is supporting regional networks, PFM networks, in a couple of regions now, Europe and Central Asia, more recently in East Asia. And so my question is really along the lines of, you know, a network of networks, learning from what works in CABRI. CABRI is one of the oldest, and by the sound of it, one of the most successful. And I'd really like to get your thoughts on what has worked well in CABRI, whether it's the structure, the organization, the types of activities you do, you know, how you find out what the members want to do. If you could give us a few insights, lessons really that we can apply in other parts of the bank, and also what hasn't worked and how has CABRI changed over the past few years? What were the most significant kind of adaptations that the network undertook to be more relevant and useful to the members? Thanks.
Thanks, Rob. One more question, maybe?
I'm Carolina Renteria. I was budget director for Colombia for 4 years, and I was, the IDB also has a network of budget directors, so I was president of that network for 2 years, but we never had like the institutionality you have in place, so I think this is a wonderful thing to see, because ours was much more flexible, and that doesn't really allow follow-up of reforms and peer learning. So I think this is a fantastic view. 2 comments or questions I have. One is, when from tables you see that there has been a lot of improvements, and I'm well surprised. But also, having been budget director, there's a huge gap between institution papers, what we are producing, and reality. So I wonder if there is an assessment of how close or far away from the ideal settings are we when at the end of the process, when reality really hits and you start to have, I don't know, matters. I was just thinking about issues of comprehensiveness or flexibility within the budget that kind of move you to a different sphere. So I wonder if there's some kind of assessment.
Please pardon the interruption. Your conference contains less than 3 participants at this time. If you would like to continue, press *1 now, or the conference will be terminated.
Our person who was on audio may have dropped. Patricia, are you still there, or have you disconnected? Probably disconnected. So
and then my second question or comment is thinking on when Anand and the rest of the speakers were talking about this weakness in upstream and downstream. I really think we have improved a lot more in upstream, and I was wondering whether that has to do because they are more macro reforms, and kind of you have the leadership of the minister or the deputy minister, while on the other hand, the implementation goes into the budget office. So it takes a budget director that is interested in doing the reforms, and it takes a lot of micro rather than macro, micro changes. So I wonder if there's some kind of work geared towards like the institutional setting and how to move this within the budget offices, because I think there's a huge amount of work that can be done there. It's very difficult, but on the other hand, it's very, I mean, what you can get from that, I think it's as important as doing big reforms.
Thank you very much. Maybe you had one more question, and then we'll go back to Neil for us.
My name is Miki Matsura. I'm also working with Rob at the Prem East Asia and setting up the PFM network in East Asia. My question is a bit more specific. And when it comes to agenda setting in CABRI, how do you actually set the agenda, given that there are a variety of stakeholders and different status of the PFM reforms? Let's say MTEF. There are countries with no MTEF. There's a country with medium-term performance framework, and their interests would vary. How much specific agenda do you set, or how do you include the other countries that's not actually may not be targeting that specific area of interest? Thanks.
Back to you, Neil.
I think the questions are for the panelists and also myself. So why don't I start on the network questions and maybe say something about participation, and then let me throw some of the other questions to the discussants. I mean, it's the what are some of the things that we did as CABRI that has, I suppose, ensured our survival. I think we've listened to our members, and we've had the joy of being a network that is owned by budget directors. So we knew exactly who to talk to, and the people we'll be talking to our peers. We've had very little, and where we have had, it's been controlled engagements with ministers of finance. We've kept CABRI away from any political agendas, so we've been quite careful about the extent to which CABRI engages with the African Union or the Economic Commission for Africa. So we've kind of, for a long time kept it under the radar and speaking directly to our peers. I think it's also about understanding what others are doing. The World Bank, the African Development Bank, OECD, and others in the area of PFM. So we don't really get into providing technical assistance or designing training programs, because that is already being provided. But CABRI can collaborate with those that provide those other important pieces of work. So we really, have seen ourselves as a network of peers, where we do exchange, and the learning that we do is done at that level. I think it's also been important for us that we've had champions over the years. So there have been African finance ministers that have been very strong champions, and we've used them strategically in ensuring that the CABRI purpose is understood. In terms of the gender setting, so we do some programs that is aimed at as many African countries as possible, but we're also doing a lot more activities that are for smaller groupings of countries. So a lot of the value for money work that we're doing involves not more than 10 countries, because we're getting finance ministry officials into the same room with sector ministry officials to speak about very specific case studies or things that they've done in their country. We've always said from the beginning that you should come to a CABRI event when you have something to share with your peer, or you're in a position to take back what you've been exposed to, what you've learned at that meeting to your own country, and you're in a position to convince those back home that this is something that we may want to do. On the participation, I think there's going to be some interesting, and there's already very interesting things happening in Kenya, where I think the Constitution and the Public Finance Management Act requires them to open up the budget process and also the post-budget tabling discussions, not only to organized civil society organizations, but also to the public. So Kenya certainly seems to be a lot more ambitious in terms of the levels of participation in the processes than even a country like South Africa. That's it.
Let me ask if any of the other discussants here want to chip in.
Just one brief response to the question regarding whether there's any way to assess the gap between the formal laws, practices, and the actual implementation on the ground, the behaviors. And I think there's one methodology that's been developed using the PIFA data, disaggregating it by sub-indicators and classifying them according to whether they refer to laws, institutions, procedures on the one hand, the de jure dimension, or whether they pertain to de facto dimensions, to actual practices like cash reconciliation or bank reconciliation or things like that. And if you do that, you can measure the implementation gap between the two. How well do you score on one dimension? How well do you score on the other dimension? And that's been done for all the countries in the world that have done PIFA assessments, and it shows the gap. Uganda is a classic case of huge gap. The laws look great on practice, the laws look great on the books, but in practice there's a big difference. So that's one way of capturing that quite objectively.
No, really, just by way of sharing information, because you asked what is the relationship between this work and the countries that have joined the OGP, including South Africa, which is a leader in the Open Government Partnership Movement. And the interesting thing is that of the 5 African countries that have made commitments under the OGP, this is Kenya, Tanzania, South Africa, Liberia, and Ghana. Each of them have 2 things that are really important to this work. One is transparency of data and information. So each of them have made real commitments to make information and data open. But secondly, a lot of the work around improving transparency of PFM systems. And these are the countries making commitments themselves. So that's quite an interesting angle to this work.
Thanks. Akshifo.
Just didn't want to be seen as not having anything interesting to say. So, but a question to Neil, really, and partly I agree with Carolina's point about the problems of budget execution being a little bit more different. And we need to think about how we address that or how we help address that. But a question to Neil. So does CABRI encourage its membership to do self-assessments of their budget systems? And do you use something like the PIFA instrument to do that self-assessment? Because right now, the original design of the PIFA, by the way, when I was involved in the early stages, was intended as that self-assessment mechanism. It's become a bit of a league table, and it's been done by this huge bureaucracy that keeps doing it periodically. What would be ideal is if an organization like CABRI or a membership like that said we can use this for self-assessment purposes and be fairly self-critical about it. Now, obviously, you can have the government doing it itself and then have a neighboring government perhaps come and do a cross-check of it. So is that something you might consider doing?
I mean, at the moment, we don't do that directly, but indirectly, I mean, the PIFA, the OBI, and other assessments are used in the programs that we undertake. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly something that we could use, especially when we're doing the peer reviews with smaller groupings of countries, where a country would be more open to undertaking such an assessment when the only other people in the room will be their peers from, say, 3 or 4 other countries. Yeah. Thanks.
A few more questions, the second round maybe.
Asad, may I come in, please?
Oh, Patricia, okay, since you have been, shall we give her a priority since you have been so patient on the phone, please?
Yeah, just a quick. I want to get a sense from Neil and the others about where we are in terms of the change management aspects of reforms. More and more of our clients are having the technocratic solutions. I think most of our clients know what to do and sequence and so. But some of the bottlenecks that come up is resistance to change, the political economy of change, those who win and those who lose from the reforms. Is CABRI looking at that and probably providing some good practice notes or some guidance to our countries navigating this reform space?
Thanks, Patricia. One or two more questions now.
Neil, it's good to see you again. I think I can trump the others. Neil and I were at the Kennedy's when you're still children. 2002. Your mic is on. I'll try and speak loudly. No, my question really was about CABRI's ability to help the poorest performers. So I can see a risk that, you know, this is a coalition of the willing, and the people who are interested are the high capacity countries, and they, you know, form a group and they go ahead and work on an issue and make progress, and the people who are at the bottom are still, you know, have the limited capacity to engage or to operationalize any of the ideas coming out of CABRI. So I'm just wondering, you know, what CABRI can offer to those countries.
Question.
But to sustain the reform, in my view, this is a science, in the sense that you need to mix certain elements and try to get off the best of the reform programs. And we have seen all these PEFAS indicators and all this around. But at the end of the day, it's coming to the projects, to the country, and how they sustain the reform initiatives. And in that sense, my question is how CABRI can help to keep the reform going on with training programs, liaisons, agreements with universities, local universities, and so on. And also, there was this reference to the demand side of the reform, but looking at the international side, in the sense that they are looking at OBI, but what about trying to do more citizen budget initiative at the local level or regional level with the countries or sectors, so that people knows exactly what's going on with the budget, they have the information, and then they can influence politics in performance budgeting and so on.
Thanks. Any other burning question? So maybe I can add two of my own questions, Neil, before turning it back to you. One is, I think, just following up on that question, you know, I think you had very laudable objectives in terms of transparency and all of that, you know, that CABRI seeks to achieve. But for the group, for the core group that you have, do you also have certain very specific targets, you know, that in 3 years' time, we as a collective want to get this to this level of performance, that we want to be in the top, whatever, decile or quartile of the open budget index, that, you know, our members are not going to be scattered along the open budget index, but you are going to, or that we will conduct a PEFA assessments for, and we want to be at certain score in that PEFA. So is there a certain target that is driving, you know, performance improvements, or that could potentially drive performance? The second is that, you know, obviously South Africa is the leader, right? I mean, it's heads and shoulders above all the others. So what's in it for South Africa to be part of this initiative? I mean, what is South Africa getting out of this initiative? That's just a political economy question that I wanted to ask you.
Thank you for those questions. On the change management question from Patricia, I mean, this is something that we want to be doing a lot more work. I mean, I describe these trolls within the system. These are, you know, the guys that are preventing you from crossing the bridge. And the only way you get around them is to outsmart them. And, you know, in changing budget systems, we are going to come up against many of those trolls. So it's certainly, I mean, Robert was mentioning that we had a discussion this morning and just before the session on the focus of our next annual seminar, and it's going to be precisely this question. How do you manage reforms? How do you provide leadership in taking reforms forward? What are some of the tools that you need to have in your toolbox when you're thinking about introducing a program-based budget? You may know technically what the reform should look like, but do you know how to implement such a reform? So the issue of change management is certainly what CABRI has identified as a very important area of work that we need to undertake. On Ivor's question, I mean, we've had a mix of countries attending our events, and sometimes when you have these bigger events with 30 to 40 countries, you do not get a good assessment of what each of the countries are getting, what kind of value they're getting out of it, because they are at different stages in their reforms. And that's why we're now doing a lot more smaller activities, either regional-based activities or activities such as our Value for Money activities, where we are looking at specific examples in a country and bringing that into the discussion. Following on from our good financial governance principles, we are doing short PFM training courses in different regions. We had one in Accra for the West African countries, and the next one's going to be in East Africa. And that looks very specifically at the problems that we identified, the weaknesses that we identified, coming out of the GFG study, and having the training focused on that. And that is also done in quite a collaborative way. I think that on sustaining reforms, I think that transparency is going to play a critical role here and provide the kind of incentive for the sustainability of many of the reforms. Because I think if we can get a level of information internally, externally, amongst the stakeholders that is available, in order for the different stakeholders to hold each other accountable. Think of the relationship between a legislator and government. If you have, sufficient information that a legislator can work with, the legislator is better able to ask the right questions of a government. And I think once you start bringing very strong accountability into your environment, you should, I think, start seeing improvements in the way that not only budgets are formulated, but also how budgets are executed. I started being familiar with the South African media, which is a very vibrant and open media, and not a day goes by without a media report on some or other service delivery failure. Now, that would not have been possible if the South African government itself was not providing good budget information in order to ascertain that X number of free textbooks was meant to be delivered to X number of poor schools. If the budget did not say that, then the media would not have been able to pick up on a story that said that those free textbooks were not delivered to those schools that should have received those textbooks. So I'm pinning a lot on transparency to provide the incentives to improve and sustain these reforms. Thanks. I think that's...
What's in it for South Africa?
What's in it for I thought I could skip that one, meet you for a beer, or maybe not a beer, orange juice, and share some insights. South Africa has participated very strongly in CABRI activities, and more so in the Value for Money activities. Very strong inputs into the health financing dialogue, and also now agriculture and education also. South Africa still has a lot to learn, and as we shift this work or our focus towards budget execution, I think a country like South Africa is going to be able to gain a lot from the work of CABRI, because I think there are some countries that are doing a lot better than South Africa when it comes to delivery of services, just in terms of quantum and proportion. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. So if there are no burning questions, or you have a burning question? Okay.
Sorry for coming so late in the discussion, but I just wanted to ask. I'm not a budget specialist, but at one point I was involved in a review of PenPal in ECA network, and my question is: have you done any self-assessment or analysis to look at CABRI as a knowledge network and how effective as a knowledge network it is? When we look at the PenPal, for example, and there was a very interesting networking, it's a tool, very effective, network analysis. How the knowledge flows within the group. It's a very interesting pattern which emerges, for example, in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. This was many years ago very much the same family of budget system, which was under the socialist development. And right now you have countries which, or I would say members of the network of budget directors who interact more between themselves because they're already in the higher end, if you look like a Croatia or Balkan countries. And you have another group of members of the network, like in Central Asia, who also create a cohort. And in one point, this can become an impediment, how the knowledge flows and how effective you can be. But my point is, have you done any self-reflection on that, how the network operates as a community of practice?
We did took a very cursory look at the concept of a network, and how most networks operate, and also what makes networks sustainable, or where networks are self-sustaining. Introduced quite a lot of concepts about the level to which networks should be concentrated or deconcentrated. What is the role of a secretariat, for instance, in a network? If the secretariat steps back, can the network proceed almost on its own? Joel is familiar with work that was done, and I think supported by WBI in South Africa some years ago, on where CABRI was looked at as a case study of a knowledge network. I think it was done by Professor Anne McLennan. Yeah. I mean, I'm not all that familiar with the work because it was. Yeah.
It didn't get at some of the things you were referring to, and I think one of the questions for you, Neil, is if you look at the diversity of the countries that you've worked in, I don't mean just from the cultural perspective, but language and systems. I think CABRI is fairly unique, certainly in Africa, and if you take it out of the political economy context, certainly in terms of institutions that are pan-African, providing kind of technical resources. The breadth of the institutions that you work with and the breadth of that capacity, I think, is fairly unique. And the perception, as you know from your travels in the rest of Africa, is that sometimes South Africa isn't part of Africa. And the fact that you've been able to bridge that gap and really make that transaction, I think, is one of the things that makes it very unique. I don't want to answer I'm not really asking a question per se, but I think you hit it on it earlier when you talked about listening and really kind of being very client focused, and I think that is one of the things that makes South African institutions unique, and certainly CABRI quite unique.
So that's not a question, it's an endorsement.
Yeah, okay. So now let me wrap up, because obviously I think people are voting with their feet. I think they have to run to other things. But thank you so much, Neil, for actually sharing your time and your thoughts and educating us a little bit about what CABRI has been doing in Africa. It is very clear to me that peer learning groups of this sort are a very powerful catalyst for change, as I think the word that Anand was using. And I think all of us learn from our peers almost as much as we learn from more formal forms of enrichment. It is also very clear that a lot of the work that you are doing is really, are areas that the World Bank Group has been engaged in many of the same countries. We are preparing a new financial management reform project in Lesotho, for instance. Lesotho is a member of CABRI. I think we need to see how we can actually connect so that we can benefit from the guidance and of this network and the implementation support or the ideas also on this new project. So I think we have to find mechanisms where we can actually work together. You are undertaking public expenditure reviews, sector reviews you call them. We call it public expenditure reviews that can be cross-sectoral or sectoral. I think there's no reason why we cannot partner on one or two and actually and work with clients to show also on the how-to, the type of things that you were talking of, that maybe your resources do not permit you to go full length. But we can actually maybe also partner on, maybe pick one country and then do a serious, review or a service delivery review or something like that, which is all extensions of similar concepts. So I think there are areas, and then as we know with the WBI's effort, I think we are also trying to create a community of practice of this. And we wrote to, I think I wrote to you to try to connect you onto this network that I think someone, Rob or someone suggested that can we hook up networks around the globe that are actually doing similar work. And I think that can also be another powerful platform for sharing information, etc. So I think there's the opportunities are boundless. I think, and the work that needs to be done is also there's a lot of work that needs to be done, as your pictures showed, in terms of the improvements that need to take place. And I think we wish you the very best, and I think we need to continue our conversations to see whether we can get some tangible areas that we can help you in your work to establish, to develop the brand of CABRI on the African continent, and to make it a real serious catalyst for change in the area of public financial management. Thank you so much.
Thank you.